They wanted us to sign a legally binding agreement that we'd name the baby Nimrod in exchange for $200,000 and a guaranteed inheritance. The lawyer explained that if we didn't sign, we'd be removed from the will entirely and cut off from the family. Blake looked at the papers and I could see him actually considering it. I stood up and told them to get out of my house. My mother-in-law started sobbing. My father-in-law said, "You're making a huge mistake." Blake didn't say anything. After they left, Blake and I had the biggest fight we'd ever had. He said I was being unreasonable and that $200,000 would change our lives. I said our son's happiness was more important than money. He said the name wasn't that bad and kids get bullied for all kinds of things. I said yes, but most parents don't deliberately choose to make their kid a target. We didn't speak for 2 days. Then I went into labor. Blake drove me to the hospital and the whole way there he kept saying, "We'll figure out the name, don't worry about it right now." Something went wrong during delivery. I started bleeding really badly and the doctors were yelling about hemorrhaging and the room filled with people. The last thing I remember was a nurse saying they needed to do an emergency transfusion. When I woke up 12 hours later, Blake was sitting next to the bed holding our son. He was crying. He handed me the birth certificate and whispered, "I'm so sorry." The name on it was Nimrod. I stared at the official state seal, the printed letters, my own signature from months ago on the pre-registration form, and then his name typed in the box where it should have said Charles. Blake kept talking, his words tumbling out about how the doctor said I might not make it. And his parents were in the waiting room and they told him it was what I would have wanted and he was so scared and he just signed everything they put in front of him. I looked up from the paper to his face, tear-streaked and desperate, and then down at the tiny person in the bassinet beside my bed who was supposed to be Charlie, but was legally something else entirely. Blake reached for my hand, but I pulled it away. I told him to get out. He started crying harder, saying we could fix it, saying he was sorry, but I just kept repeating that he needed to leave right now because I couldn't look at him. The nurse who'd been checking my blood pressure during this whole thing caught my eye and asked quietly if I needed her to enforce visitor restrictions. I nodded. Blake stood there for another few seconds like he might argue, then walked out with his shoulders shaking. The door clicked shut and I was alone with a baby whose legal name made me want to throw up, still hooked up to an IV from nearly bleeding to death 12 hours earlier. I picked him up carefully, mindful of all the tubes and wires still attached to me, and whispered that his name was Charlie no matter what any paper said. He made a small sound and I started crying. Not the pretty kind, but the ugly sobbing kind where you can't breathe right. Hours later, after I'd fed him and changed him, and just stared at his face trying to memorize every detail, a woman in scrubs knocked and introduced herself as the social worker doing evening rounds. She sat down in the chair Blake had vacated and started asking the standard questions about support at home and postpartum resources, but then she paused and looked at the chart. She asked why I kept calling the baby Charlie when all the paperwork said Nimrod. I explained the whole thing, the 400-year tradition, the pressure campaign, Blake signing while I was unconscious, and she listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said birth certificate amendments were possible but required legal process, and she could connect me with a patient advocate who specialized in these situations. She wrote down a name and extension number on a post-it note and stuck it to my bedside table, then squeezed my hand and said she'd check on me tomorrow. I was still holding that